So I just rewatched one of my favorite horror movies, which is Scream, released in 1996. This franchise is probably one of the most fun in terms of a series that isn't afraid to poke fun at itself and subvert its own story and tropes in a really interesting way, while also being well written enough and in some areas scary enough to keep you on your toes, especially on first viewing. Scream, the first one in particular, I think, was great in that it also positioned a character who normally is portrayed in a fairly helpless light through most of the movie in a much more resourceful and self-deterministic sort of way. And that's, of course, Sidney Prescott. I think she's probably one of my favorite horror movie protagonists because of how smart and resourceful she is. I think that in the first movie in particular, a lot of her fight scenes and a lot of the scenes where she's being chased by the killer, she's always one or two steps ahead. And after the first time she's attacked, she never really lets her guard down, even though people around her tend to do that. And the few scenes where someone does get the drop on her, she tends to recover very quickly. And I don't know, I just find her to be a really engaging character. I think Neve Campbell does a great job of portraying her in a way that makes some of the questionable writing decisions more believable. I also really enjoy the conflict between her and Gale Weathers and how that sort of resolves by the end of the first movie. I love Courtney Cox as Gale Weathers. I, in general, do like Courtney Cox, though, because I love Friends, even though it has its problems, and I really like Monica, so I'm just biased. I like Gale Weathers. I think she's also just, in general, a really fun character, and I like that she's careless and willing to do anything for a story, and then when she gets in over her head is willing to fight for her survival. So I enjoy the sort of weird setups and quality payoffs that you get from that movie. I also watched the Scream TV show, and that was interesting. I would say it's better than the Degrassi The Next Class Netflix reboot, and it's better than Riverdale in terms of at least taking some creative license with source material and actually using the source material a little bit, but I don't know if I like it as much as a lot of other people did. I thought that there were a lot of weird pacing issues with the show and a lot of kind of clumsy twists and turns that sort of reminded me of Pretty Little Liars, in that you know that if it's going to be a serial seasonal thing, there's always going to be some new reason for the killer to come back, or they'll pass on the torch or something like that. And so it kind of makes it a little bit harder to believe, I guess, than just a straight, progression with movies sequels. Because I think just to keep a series going, you have to make it all so much more elaborate, and then that suspension of disbelief gets a lot harder. But the movie, I think, what makes it work so well is how tight it keeps the story and how consistently it reinforces that it's also tongue-in-cheek. There are a lot of moments where the story doesn't take itself too seriously and where it really plays openly with the themes that are common in horror movies and sometimes makes fun of them. I think that the scene where they're watching the horror movies during the party scene is probably one of the most fun scenes in any horror movie, in particular where Randy is sitting on the couch watching the movie with the killer coming up behind him while he's warning the character on the screen about the killer coming up behind them. Like, little scenes like that where they make the characters feel at ease in a situation where they're not, and at that point they start discussing horror movie tropes. I just find that so enjoyable and creative. So 21 years later, I'm still rewatching this movie and still finding myself more drawn into it than by a lot of modern horror movies. I think that it is just a classic horror movie, and if for October you're looking for some horror series to binge watch, the Scream series is a satisfying series. The sequels aren't as good but have their moments. And the original is just an absolute classic. There are so many just amazing jokes and Easter eggs and references that make this movie pure gold. And for me, I love that it subverts the trope that the only one that can survive a horror movie is a virgin character who has some kind of moral high ground over other female characters. I like that Sidney, right before the climax of the movie, actually undermines that shortly after it's been referenced in the film. And for me, I felt like that was a really important thing to add into the horror lexicon, sort of to undo this stereotype of horror movies that try to punish female characters for having sex, because I have a lot of problems with those movies because they reinforce some really harmful cultural ideas in a way that isn't clearly enough, or isn't subverted clearly enough. Whereas I think Scream brings a lot of those issues right to the surface and deals with them in a way that's still interesting for the story. Because I think part of making social progress through media and film is doing so in a way that makes people want to watch it and interested to watch it. Because if it's not a good story and you're just using it as a soapbox, then it's not going to be particularly interesting. You have to draw people in with a good story first, and gimmicky messages second. So I think that the way that Scream is written actually makes it a more feminist horror movie, especially for its time, than a lot of the horror movies that we still see today. I will rewatch this movie probably every October, and I recommend you do as well. That's all I have for this. If you agree, let me know in the comments down below. If you disagree, tell me what your favorite horror movie is. I'm always looking for new recommendations. If you like this video, subscribe. If you didn't, I'm sure you'll let me know. Wiedersehen.